Hey guys, tonight we begin a story that will make you question everything you think you know about love, power, and the price of passion. Picture this. The year is 1115, and in the cobblestone streets of Paris, a scandal is brewing that will rock medieval Europe to its very core. A brilliant monk, considered the smartest man alive, is about to throw away everything, his career, his reputation, his very manhood, for a 17-year-old girl who's too intelligent for her own good. But here's the twist that'll keep you awake tonight. She saw it coming. She warned him. She practically begged him to stop. And yet, like a moth to a flame, he flew straight into the fire that would destroy them both. What happens when the most powerful man in academia meets his match in a teenage genius? And why did their forbidden love affair end with one of the most brutal acts of revenge in medieval history? Now, before we dive deep into this tale of passion and destruction, I'd love it if you could hit that subscribe button and give this video a like, but only if you're genuinely enjoying the journey we're about to take together. And hey, I'm curious, where are you listening to this story tonight? Your bedroom? A late night drive? Drop a comment and let me know what drew you to this medieval love story. Now, dim those lights, get comfortable, and let's step back in time to discover how one man's desire changed the course of history forever. Close your eyes and imagine medieval Paris, not the romantic city of lights we know today, but a gritty, bustling metropolis where knowledge was power and power was everything. The year is 1115, and if you were walking through the narrow, muddy streets near Notre Dame, you'd hear whispers of one name on everyone's lips: Peter Abelard. Now, I want you to think of the smartest person you've ever met. Got someone in mind? Well, Peter Abelard would have made them look like they were still learning their ABCs. This man wasn't just brilliant, he was devastatingly, almost supernaturally intelligent. At an age when most men were still figuring out which end of a sword to hold, Abelard was already dismantling the greatest philosophers of his time in public debates that drew crowds like modern-day rock concerts. But here's what makes this story so fascinating and so tragic. Abelard wasn't just smart, he was arrogant. Imagine the confidence of a tech billionaire, the charisma of a movie star, and the ego of someone who's never been told no in their entire life. That was Peter Abelard. He strutted through the University of Paris like he owned the place. Because honestly, he kind of did. Students would travel hundreds of miles just to hear him speak. Kings sought his counsel. The church, despite being slightly nervous about his radical ideas, couldn't deny his genius. He was the medieval equivalent of going viral before anyone knew what that meant. And just like many brilliant people throughout history, his greatest strength was about to become his greatest weakness. You see, Abelard had spent his entire adult life in the world of ideas, of pure thought, of intellectual conquest. He could debate theology with bishops, philosophy with scholars, logic with the greatest minds of Europe. But there was one area of human experience he'd completely avoided. One challenge he'd never faced. The heart of a woman who was every bit his intellectual equal. Enter Heloise. And oh, what an entrance it was. Picture a 17-year-old girl in 1115. Most would be married off already. Probably to some lord they'd never met. Expected to produce heirs and keep quiet. But Heloise, she was reading Latin poetry for fun, debating philosophy with grown men, and writing letters that would later be studied in universities for centuries, in a world where most women weren't even taught to read. She was composing original thoughts that challenged the greatest minds of her age. Her uncle, Canon Fulbert, was one of the most powerful religious figures in Paris. He doted on his brilliant niece, perhaps seeing in her the son he never had. the intellectual legacy he'd always dreamed of. Eloise lived in his grand house near Notre Dame, surrounded by books, manuscripts, and the constant flow of the most educated men in Europe who came to seek her uncle's favor. But here's where our story takes its first dark turn. Canon Fulbert, for all his religious wisdom, made what might be the most catastrophic misjudgment in medieval history. He looked at his brilliant, beautiful, 17-year-old niece, and then at Peter Abelard, the most charismatic, confident, and devastatingly attractive intellectual in all of Europe, and thought, what could possibly go wrong if I hire him as a private tutor? It's almost comical when you think about it. Imagine hiring a wolf to guard your sheep, then acting surprised when you come home to find chaos. But that's exactly what Canon Fulbert did. He was so impressed by Abelard's reputation, so eager to give his niece the finest education money could buy, that he completely ignored every warning sign that should have been flashing bright red in his mind. You have to understand, in medieval society, this arrangement was like putting a lit match next to a powder keg. A young, brilliant woman, isolated from society, spending hours alone with a man who had never met an intellectual challenge he couldn't conquer. The only question wasn't whether something would happen. It was how long it would take. And Peter Abelard? Well, he walked into that house with all the confidence of a man who'd never failed at anything in his life. He probably thought teaching a teenage girl would be the easiest job he'd ever had. After all, what could a 17-year-old possibly teach him? He was about to find out that sometimes the student becomes the teacher in ways you never expect, and sometimes the lesson destroys everything you thought you knew about yourself. But before we discover exactly how this brilliant monk fell from grace, let me ask you this. Have you ever been so confident in your abilities that you walked blindly into a situation that would change your life forever? Because that's exactly what Peter Abelard did when he knocked on Canon Fulbert's door for the first time. The stage was set, the players were in position, and medieval Europe was about to witness a love story so intense, so passionate, and so ultimately destructive that we're still talking about it 900 years later. Coming up next, we'll dive deep into the mind of the man who thought he could conquer everything, including love itself. You won't believe what happens when the medieval world's greatest intellectual finally meets his match. So who exactly was this man who thought he could have it all? Let me paint you a picture of Peter Abelard that will help you understand just how catastrophic his fall from grace really was. Imagine growing up in rural Brittany in the late 1000s. We're talking about a time when most people never traveled more than 20 miles from where they were born, when the vast majority couldn't even write their own names. Now picture a farmer's son who not only learned to read, but devoured every book he could get his hands on like he was starving for knowledge. That was Peter Abelard. Born around 1079 in a small village called Le Palais, he was the eldest son of a minor knight named Berenger. And here's where the story gets interesting. His father actually wanted him to become a warrior, to follow the family tradition of military service. But young Peter took one look at a sword and basically said, "Thanks, but no thanks. I'll conquer the world with my mind instead." And conquer he did. By the time he reached his 20s, Abelard had already studied under the greatest masters in France. But here's the thing that made him different from every other brilliant student of his era. He didn't just learn from his teachers. He systematically destroyed them in public debates. Picture this. It's around 1100, and the most respected philosopher in all of France is a man named William of Champeaux. This guy was like the Stephen Hawking of medieval philosophy. Everyone revered him. Students hung on his every word, and his theories were considered virtually unshakable. Then along comes this cocky young man from the countryside who raises his hand and says, "Actually, Master, I think you're completely wrong about everything. The audacity. But here's the kicker. Abelard wasn't just being rebellious. He was right, and he proved it. Point by devastating point, in front of hundreds of students and scholars, William of Champeaux, this giant of medieval thought, was so thoroughly demolished by his young student that he actually retreated from Paris in humiliation. Now, imagine being a 20-something-year-old and publicly humiliating the most famous intellectual in Europe. How would that feel? If you're thinking, probably pretty intoxicating, you'd be absolutely right. And that's exactly what happened to Abelard. He got drunk on his own brilliance. Word spread like wildfire through the medieval academic world. Students began abandoning their current masters to flock to this young upstart who was revolutionizing how people thought about logic, theology, and philosophy. By 1113, when he was barely in his 30s, Peter Abelard had been appointed to teach at the Cathedral School of Notre Dame, essentially making him the most powerful academic figure in Paris. Let me put this in perspective for you. In medieval times, the Catholic Church controlled virtually all education. To be chosen to teach at Notre Dame wasn't just getting a prestigious job. It was like being handed the keys to the intellectual kingdom of Europe. Students came from England, Germany, Italy, even from as far away as Scandinavia, just to study under Master Abelard, and he loved every minute of it. Contemporary accounts describe him as devastatingly handsome, with piercing eyes and a voice that could make complex philosophy sound like poetry. One of his students wrote that when Abelard walked into a room, it was as if the very air became more intelligent. Women would sneak into his lectures, even though it was technically forbidden, just to hear him speak. But here's what made Abelard truly dangerous, and I mean that in the most fascinating way possible. He wasn't content to just repeat the accepted wisdom of the church. He asked questions that made people uncomfortable. Questions like, how can we know something is true just because authority tells us it's true? Shouldn't we use reason to examine everything, even religious doctrine? In our modern world, these seem like perfectly reasonable questions. But in 1115, this was radical, borderline heretical thinking. The church had spent centuries building a system where faith trumped reason, where questioning authority was seen as questioning God himself. And here was Abelard, standing in the shadow of Notre Dame Cathedral, teaching students to think for themselves. He developed what would later be called the scholastic method, essentially the idea that you could use logic and reason to examine religious truth. His most famous work, Si Non, Yes and No, presented seemingly contradictory statements from church fathers and challenged readers to use reason to reconcile them. Think about the courage that took, or, depending on how you look at it, the incredible arrogance. Here was a man who looked at 1,000 years of religious tradition and said, I think I can do this better. And the terrifying thing, he probably could. Abelard's lectures were standing room only events. Students would arrive hours early just to get a seat. He commanded fees that were astronomical for the time. Some nobles paid him more to tutor their sons than they paid their entire household staff for a year. By medieval standards, Peter Abelard was filthy rich, world famous, and intellectually untouchable. But here's where our story takes on an almost mythical quality. Success, especially the kind of overwhelming success Abelard achieved, has a way of warping a person's perspective. When you've never lost a debate, never failed to solve a problem, never met an intellectual challenge you couldn't overcome, you start to believe you're invincible. Abelard began to see himself as more than just a teacher or philosopher. He saw himself as a revolutionary, a man destined to reshape how humanity understood truth itself. And when you believe you're destined to change the world, the normal rules, social conventions, moral boundaries, even basic common sense, start to feel like they don't apply to you. His fellow scholars noticed the change. Where once he had been confident but respectful, he became dismissive of anyone who disagreed with him. Where once he had engaged in friendly debate, he began to humiliate opponents with a cruel precision that left them intellectually blooded. One contemporary chronicler wrote that Abelard wielded logic like a sword, cutting down anyone who dared stand in his path. And that's exactly the mindset he was in when Canon Fulber came knocking with his proposition. Here was this powerful church official, practically begging the great Peter Abelard to tutor his niece. The fee was generous. The arrangement was convenient. Abelard would actually live in Fulber's house to provide more intensive instruction. And honestly, how hard could it be to teach a 17-year-old girl? Abelard probably saw it as easy money. A few hours a week explaining basic logic and rhetoric to some sheltered nobleman's daughter. He could do that in his sleep. It would barely take any time away from his real work, his writing, his lectures, his grand project of revolutionizing human thought. He had no idea he was about to meet someone who would challenge him in ways he'd never imagined. Someone who would see right through his intellectual armor and find the man underneath. Someone who would make him question everything he thought he knew about himself. Because that's the thing about genius. It recognizes itself. And when two brilliant minds collide, especially when one of them belongs to a young woman who's been told her entire life that she should be quiet, grateful, and intellectually invisible, well, that's when things get interesting. Next, we're going to meet the girl who was about to turn the great Peter Abelard's world completely upside down. And trust me, once you understand just how extraordinary Heloise really was, you'll realize why this wasn't just a case of a powerful man taking advantage of a young student. This was something far more complex, far more dangerous, and far more tragic than anyone could have predicted. Now, let's talk about a young woman who was so brilliant, so dangerously intelligent, that she would have been considered a threat to the natural order of medieval society, if anyone had truly understood what they were dealing with. Heloise wasn't just smart for a woman of her time. She wasn't just smart for a 17-year-old. She was smart, period, full stop. In an era when most nobles couldn't read beyond their own names, when even educated men struggled with basic Latin. Heloise was fluent in Latin, Greek, and Hebrew. She could quote classical poetry from memory, engage in complex theological debates, and write original philosophical arguments that would impress scholars twice her age. But here's what makes her story so heartbreaking, and so relevant even today. She was trapped in a world that had absolutely no idea what to do with a woman like her. Picture medieval society as a giant machine, perfectly designed to sort people into neat little boxes. Men could be warriors, merchants, scholars, or priests. Women, well, women could be wives, mothers, nuns, or that was pretty much it. There was no box labeled female genius. There was no category for woman who could outthink most men in Europe. The very concept was so foreign that it might as well have been science fiction. And yet, there she was. Born around 1098, Heloise was the niece of Canon Fulber, one of the most powerful religious figures in Paris. Now, Fulber was an interesting character himself, progressive enough to recognize his niece's extraordinary gifts, but still very much a man of his time. He saw her intelligence as a wonderful ornament, something that made his household more prestigious, like owning a particularly beautiful piece of art. What he didn't understand, what nobody understood, was that Eloise's mind wasn't just decorative, it was active, hungry, constantly questioning and analyzing everything around her. While other young women her age were learning embroidery and household management, Eloise was diving deep into the works of Aristotle, Cicero, and the Church Fathers. Contemporary accounts describe her as breathtakingly beautiful, but they also mention something that clearly made people uncomfortable: her eyes. Multiple chroniclers noted that when Eloise looked at you, she seemed to be thinking, calculating, seeing right through whatever facade you might be presenting. One visiting scholar wrote that conversation with her was like being examined by a particularly astute judge who could detect every flaw in your reasoning. Can you imagine what that must have been like for her? To live in a world where everyone expected you to be quiet, submissive, and grateful, while your mind was constantly buzzing with ideas, questions, and insights that no one wanted to hear. She lived in her uncle's grand house near Notre Dame, surrounded by some of the most educated men in Europe who came to seek Fulbert's favor. And here's the fascinating part. Many of them were intimidated by her. There are records of visiting scholars who would specifically request that Eloise not be present during their discussions with her uncle, because they found her questions unsettling and her insights inappropriately penetrating. Think about that for a moment. Grown men, educated men, men who considered themselves intellectuals, were afraid of a teenage girl's mind. But Eloise wasn't just brilliant in an abstract academic way. She was emotionally intelligent too, with an understanding of human nature that was almost uncanny. She could read people's motivations, see through their pretenses, and predict their behavior with startling accuracy. It's this combination, intellectual brilliance paired with emotional insight, that would make her so dangerous to Peter Abelard. Now, here's where the story gets really interesting and really tragic. Eloise knew exactly what she was. She understood her own intelligence, recognized her own worth, and was acutely aware of how limited her options were. In one of her later letters, she wrote something that still gives me chills. What misery there is in being born a woman, when even the path to God is made narrow by the world's expectations. She had been educated to the level of a master scholar, but there was nowhere for that education to take her. She couldn't teach at the university. Women were forbidden. She couldn't become a priest or bishop. Obviously impossible. She couldn't even inherit her uncle's position, despite being more qualified than most of the men who would compete for it. Her only socially acceptable futures were marriage to some nobleman who would probably see her intelligence as an inconvenience, or becoming a nun and spending her life in silent contemplation. Is it any wonder that when Peter Abelard walked into her life, she saw him as a potential escape route? But here's what makes Eloise truly extraordinary. She wasn't naive about what she was getting into. Unlike Abelard, who seemed to stumble blindly into their affair, Eloise calculated the risks from the very beginning. She understood the potential consequences, not just for herself, but for him as well. And in a move that shows just how brilliant she really was, she tried to warn him. Before we get to their first meeting, let me share something that will blow your mind about medieval attitudes toward intelligent women. There was actually a term used by church scholars, femina docta, the learned woman, and it wasn't meant as a compliment. These women were seen as fundamentally unnatural, dangerous disruptions to God's intended order. Some theologians seriously debated whether highly intelligent women were more susceptible to demonic possession. Because how else could you explain a female mind that functioned like a male's? Heloise would have known this. she would have understood that her very existence was seen as problematic by the society around her. And yet, she refused to dim her light, refused to pretend to be less than she was. There's something almost heroic about a 17-year-old girl insisting on her right to think, to question, to engage with ideas at the highest level, even when everyone around her was telling her it was inappropriate. She wrote poetry that scholars still study today. She engaged in philosophical debates with some of the greatest minds of her era. She developed original theological insights that influenced religious thought for centuries. And she did all of this while living in a world that believed women's brains were literally smaller and less capable than men's. But perhaps most remarkably, she maintained her intellectual independence even when it would have been so much easier to simply conform. Other noble women of her era learned to hide their intelligence, to ask questions in ways that made men feel smart for answering them, to present their insights as if they were just lucky guesses. Not Eloise. When she disagreed with someone, she said so. When she had a better idea, she shared it. When she saw flaws in reasoning, she pointed them out. This combination, beauty, brilliance, and complete intellectual fearlessness, was what made her so captivating and so dangerous. By 1115, when she was 17, Eloise had already gained a reputation throughout scholarly Paris. Visitors to her uncle's house would often request to meet the remarkable niece they'd heard so much about. Some came out of curiosity, others out of skepticism, wanting to test whether this young woman was really as brilliant as people claimed. She never disappointed them, and she never let them leave without realizing they'd encountered something unprecedented, a female mind that operated at the very highest levels of human intelligence. So when Canon Fulbert made his fateful decision to hire Peter Abelard as a tutor, he wasn't just bringing together a teacher and student. He was about to create a collision between two of the most brilliant minds of the medieval era, one who had conquered the academic world through sheer intellectual dominance, and one who'd been forced to navigate that same world while fighting for the basic right to use her mind at all. The question wasn't whether sparks would fly. The question was whether either of them would survive the fire they were about to create. And as we'll discover in just a moment, Canon Fulbert's decision to bring these two extraordinary people together would trigger a chain of events that would destroy lives, challenge the very foundations of medieval society, and create a love story so powerful that we're still talking about it 9 centuries later. Sometimes the most catastrophic decisions in history start with the most logical reasoning, and that's exactly what happened when Canon Fulbert sat in his study one autumn evening in 1115, convinced he was about to make the smartest move of his life. Picture Fulbert, a man in his 50s, respected throughout Paris, wealthy enough to afford the finest things in life, and absolutely devoted to his brilliant niece. He had watched Eloise grow from a precocious child into an intellectual powerhouse, and he wanted nothing but the best for her. The problem was, he had no idea what the best actually meant for a young woman like her. In Fulbert's mind, the equation was beautifully simple. His niece was extraordinarily gifted, perhaps the most intelligent young person in all of Paris. Therefore, she deserved to be taught by the most brilliant teacher available. And who was the most brilliant teacher in Europe? Peter Abelard, without question. It's almost endearing how proud Fulbert was of this logic. He probably spent weeks congratulating himself on his cleverness. Here he was, securing the services of the most sought-after intellectual in the known world for his beloved niece. Other nobles were paying fortunes just to get their sons into Abelard's regular lectures, and Fulbert was going to arrange for private, personalized instruction. But here's where Fulbert's reasoning reveals a blind spot so massive, it's almost comical. He was thinking like a medieval man about a medieval woman, which meant he literally could not conceive of his niece as a sexual being. In his mind, Eloise was still essentially a child, innocent and pure, someone who needed protection rather than someone who might be dangerous to protect against. And Peter Abelard, well, Fulber saw him as the ultimate safe choice. This was a man who had dedicated his entire life to intellectual pursuits, someone who had spent decades in scholarly circles without a hint of scandal. Abelard was, by all accounts, completely celibate, not because he was a priest, mind you, but because he seemed to consider physical desires beneath his lofty intellectual pursuits. Fulber probably thought he was hiring a living encyclopedia, not a devastatingly charming man in his prime who had simply never encountered a woman worth compromising his principles for. The negotiations were surprisingly straightforward. Abelard's usual teaching fees were astronomical. Some nobles paid him more than a master craftsman earned in 5 years. But Fulber had a better offer. Instead of payment, Abelard could live in the Fulber household, saving the considerable expense of maintaining his own residence in expensive central Paris. For Abelard, this arrangement was like winning the lottery. He would have a beautiful, quiet place to live and work, regular meals prepared by skilled servants, and access to Fulbert's impressive personal library. Plus, he'd be earning money for what seemed like the easiest job imaginable, tutoring one young girl in basic subjects he could teach in his sleep. The contract they drew up was remarkably detailed, and reading it today, you can see exactly how catastrophically both men misunderstood what they were setting in motion. Fulber specified that Abelard would have complete authority over the girl's education and conduct. He was given permission to use whatever methods of instruction he deemed necessary, including disciplinary measures should the student prove difficult or inattentive. Pause for a moment and think about what this meant. Fulber was essentially giving Peter Abelard unlimited access to his niece, complete privacy for their lessons, and explicit permission to spend as much time alone with her as he felt was educationally necessary. And here's the detail that makes this whole arrangement seem almost supernaturally naive. Fulber's house was designed to give the tutor and student maximum privacy. The room designated for Eloise's lessons was in a quiet wing of the house, separated from the main living areas by a long corridor and 2 heavy wooden doors. Fulber specifically chose this location so that the lessons wouldn't be disturbed by household noise or activity. Imagine being an architect of disaster and not even realizing it. Fulber had essentially created the perfect environment for a secret affair, then invited 2 of the most charismatic and intellectually compatible people in medieval Europe to spend unlimited time alone together in it. But here's what makes this story so fascinating and so tragic. Fulber wasn't actually stupid. He was a shrewd, intelligent man who'd successfully navigated the complex politics of medieval church hierarchy for decades. He understood human nature well enough to accumulate significant wealth and influence. So how could he be so completely blind to the obvious risks? The answer reveals something profound about medieval attitudes toward women and sexuality. In Fulber's worldview, intellectual women simply weren't sexual beings. The very idea of a woman being both brilliant and physically desirable was almost incomprehensible to him. Smart women were supposed to be like nuns, pure, devoted to higher pursuits, completely removed from earthly temptations. And then there was his assessment of Abelard's character. Remember, this was a man who had built his entire reputation on self-control and intellectual discipline. For over a decade, Abelard had lived like a monk without actually being one. He attended no social gatherings, showed no interest in women, and seemed to find all his satisfaction in academic achievement. What Fulber didn't understand What he couldn't understand was that Abelard's celibacy wasn't based on lack of desire. It was based on lack of worthy objects for that desire. He had simply never met a woman who could engage both his mind and his heart simultaneously. The irony is breathtaking. Fulber thought he was protecting his niece by choosing a teacher who was above such base concerns as physical attraction. Instead, he was delivering her directly into the hands of a man who would find her irresistible, precisely because she could match his intellectual passion. There's another layer to this disaster that makes it even more tragic. Fulber genuinely loved Eloise. She wasn't just his ward or responsibility. She was the daughter he'd never had, the intellectual heir who made him proud. His decision to hire Abelard came from a place of pure affection and ambition for her future. In his mind, he was giving her the gift of a lifetime. Access to the greatest teacher in Europe. Personalized instruction that would refine her already remarkable abilities, and the chance to engage with ideas at the very highest level. He probably imagined himself years later, proudly telling visitors about his niece's extraordinary education and accomplishments. What he was actually doing was setting up the dominoes for one of the most spectacular personal disasters in medieval history. The contract was signed in late 1115, just as winter was beginning to settle over Paris. The arrangement would begin after the new year, giving Abelard time to settle his affairs and prepare for his new living situation. Fulber was so pleased with himself that he began bragging to other nobles about the coup he had pulled off, securing Abelard's services for his niece's education. And Peter Abelard? He was equally satisfied with the arrangement. A comfortable place to live, good money for easy work, and the chance to polish his already stellar reputation by producing an exceptionally well-educated young woman who would reflect well on his teaching abilities. It seemed like the perfect situation for everyone involved. Neither man had the slightest idea that they were about to unleash forces that would destroy lives, scandalize all of Europe, and challenge the very foundations of medieval society. They couldn't see the trap they were setting, because they couldn't imagine that two people could be so perfectly, catastrophically matched. As winter deepened and preparations were made for Abelard's arrival, you have to wonder if anyone had even the slightest premonition of what was coming. Did any of the servants notice the dangerous possibilities in this arrangement? Did any of Fulbert's friends think to warn him? Did Eloise herself, with her remarkable insight into human nature, see the collision that was approaching? Because in just a few weeks, when Peter Abelard walked through the front door of Canon Fulber's house and came face to face with Eloise for the first time, everything was going to change. The greatest intellectual of medieval Europe was about to meet his match in ways he never could have imagined. And the most brilliant young woman in Paris was about to discover just how dangerous it could be to get everything you'd ever wanted. The morning everything changed started like any other winter day in medieval Paris. January 1116 was bitterly cold, and Peter Abelard wrapped his finest cloak around his shoulders as he made his way through the narrow streets toward Canon Fulbert's house. He was carrying a leather satchel filled with carefully selected texts. Aristotle's logic, some basic rhetoric, perhaps a bit of introductory theology. Nothing too challenging for a young girl's mind. He had no idea he was walking toward the most dangerous moment of his life. Picture Abelard that morning, confident, slightly amused by this easy assignment, probably already mentally composing the lessons he would teach. He'd tutored before, of course, but always young men, usually the dim-witted sons of nobles who needed help getting through their basic studies. How different could teaching a girl be? When the heavy wooden door of Fulber's house swung open, Abelard expected to see a servant. Instead, he found himself face to face with Canon Fulber himself, beaming with pride and excitement. Master Abelard, Fulbert exclaimed, practically bouncing on his toes. Welcome, welcome. Come in, come in. I can't wait for you to meet my extraordinary niece. And that's when Peter Abelard made his first crucial mistake. He smiled indulgently and thought to himself, how extraordinary could she possibly be? The house was impressive. High ceilings, expensive tapestries, the kind of place that spoke of both wealth and refined taste. Fulbert led him through a series of corridors, chattering excitedly about the arrangements he'd made, the perfect study room he'd prepared, the exceptional library Abelard would have access to. She's waiting in the solar, Fulbert said, referring to the bright upper room where noble families typically spent their leisure time. I told her to prepare some questions to demonstrate her current level of understanding. You'll be amazed, Master Abelard. Simply amazed. They climbed a narrow stone staircase, and with each step, Abelard's amusement grew. Fulbert was clearly one of those doting relatives who saw genius in every childish comment their beloved made. This was going to be even easier than he'd thought. The solar was a beautiful room, filled with morning light from large windows that overlooked the Seine. Books were stacked on several tables, and a fire crackled warmly in the corner. And there, silhouetted against one of those bright windows, stood a young woman reading. She turned when they entered, and Peter Abelard's world shifted on its axis. Here's what he later wrote about that first moment in a letter that still exists today. When I first beheld Eloise, I felt as though I had spent my entire life reading about fire without understanding that it could burn. The woman who faced him wasn't the sheltered, innocent girl he'd been expecting. This was someone who carried herself with quiet confidence, whose intelligent eyes seemed to assess him as carefully as he was assessing her. She was beautiful, yes, but it was her composure that struck him first. The way she seemed completely at ease in her own skin, completely comfortable with her own mind. Master Abelard, she said, and her voice was warm but not deferential. I've heard so much about your work on dialectical reasoning. I'm particularly interested in your thoughts on the problem of universals. Abelard blinked. The problem of universals was one of the most complex philosophical questions of the age. Something that had stumped scholars for centuries. It wasn't the kind of thing you brought up in casual conversation, and it certainly wasn't something a 17-year-old girl should even know existed. Yes, he managed. That's quite an advanced topic. Is it? Heloise smiled, and there was something in that smile that made Abelard's carefully ordered world wobble slightly. I've been reading Porphyry's introduction to Aristotle's categories, and I find myself puzzled by his treatment of the question. It seems to me that he's avoiding the real issue rather than addressing it. And just like that, Peter Abelard, the man who had intellectually demolished every opponent he'd ever faced, found himself in the most stimulating philosophical conversation he'd had in years, with a teenage girl who was not only following his advanced arguments, but contributing original insights that made him reconsider positions he'd held for decades. Fulbert stood beaming in the corner, clearly delighted but probably understanding about half of what they were discussing. After an hour of increasingly complex debate, he finally interrupted. Well, I can see you two are going to get along splendidly. I'll leave you to work out the details of the tutoring schedule. And then he left. Actually left them alone together. This powerful, protective uncle who loved his niece more than life itself walked out of the room and closed the door behind him, leaving his 17-year-old ward alone with a man who was already falling under her spell. The silence that followed was electric. Abelard looked at Eloise, really looked at her, and realized he had never encountered anyone quite like her. She wasn't just intelligent. She was intellectually fearless. When he posed complex questions, she didn't hesitate or defer to his authority. She thought through the problems herself and offered answers that were often better than his own. So, Heloise said, settling into a chair with a kind of grace that suggested she was accustomed to being the centre of attention. What did you really think of my uncle's proposal? The truth, not the polite version you gave him. The directness of the question caught Abelard off guard. I thought it would be simple, he admitted. I expected to teach basic logic to a sheltered young woman who needed intellectual polish. And now? Abelard studied her face, trying to read her expression. Now I think your uncle may have hired a student for his teacher, rather than the other way around. Heloise laughed, and the sound sent an unexpected jolt through Abelard's carefully controlled world. How refreshing, she said. Most men would have pretended they knew exactly what they were getting into, even after being proved wrong. And that's when Peter Abelard realized he was in trouble. Real trouble. Over the next few days, as they established their tutoring routine, Abelard discovered that every assumption he'd made about this arrangement was wrong. Eloise wasn't a passive student waiting to absorb his wisdom. She was an intellectual equal who challenged him, questioned him, and frequently taught him things he hadn't known. More dangerously, she seemed to see right through the careful persona he'd constructed over the years. Where others saw the great master Abelard, the untouchable intellectual giant, Heloise saw a man, a brilliant, accomplished, but fundamentally lonely man who had spent so many years in the world of abstract ideas that he'd forgotten how to connect with another human being. Their lessons, which were supposed to focus on basic rhetoric and logic, quickly evolved into wide-ranging discussions about philosophy, theology, literature, and life itself. Abelard found himself sharing thoughts and ideas he'd never discussed with anyone, while Eloise revealed insights that made him question everything he thought he knew about the world. And through it all, there was an undercurrent of something neither of them was quite ready to acknowledge. A tension that had nothing to do with academic debate, and everything to do with the way she looked at him when she thought he wasn't watching, or the way his heart rate quickened when she leaned closer to examine a text he was showing her. Abelard had spent 37 years believing that intellectual achievement was the highest form of human fulfillment. Suddenly, he was discovering that all his scholarly accomplishments felt hollow compared to the simple pleasure of making Eloise smile, or seeing her eyes light up when she grasped a particularly complex concept. He was walking into a trap, and the most dangerous part was that he was doing it willingly. Every day, he could have stepped back, maintained proper distance, kept their relationship purely academic. Every day, he chose not to, because for the first time in his life, Peter Abelard had found someone who could match not just his intellect, but his passion for ideas, his hunger for understanding, his need to connect with another mind at the deepest possible level. And Eloise? Well, she was discovering what it felt like to be truly seen and valued for her mind, rather than dismissed or patronized because of her gender. For a young woman who had spent her entire life being told she was remarkable, for a girl, the experience of being treated as an intellectual equal was intoxicating. Neither of them was thinking clearly about where this was heading. They were too caught up in the sheer joy of intellectual connection, too amazed by finding someone who could keep up with their minds, too intoxicated by conversations that lasted for hours and left them both feeling more alive than they'd ever felt before. But as winter turned towards spring, and their daily lessons became the highlights of both their lives, the inevitable was approaching. Because you can't put two brilliant, passionate people together for hours every day, give them complete privacy, and expect them to remain purely academic forever. The question wasn't whether they would cross the line from teacher and student to something more dangerous. The question was when and how, and what the consequences would be when they finally acknowledged what was happening between them. What happens when two brilliant people start playing with fire for 3 months? Peter Abelard and Eloise danced around the growing attraction between them, pretending their relationship was purely academic, while the tension in that sunlit study room became almost unbearable. By spring of 1116, their daily routine had evolved into something that would have scandalized medieval Paris if anyone had bothered to pay attention. They met every morning after dawn prayers, ostensibly to work on Eloise's education. But somewhere along the way, those formal lessons had transformed into something much more intimate and dangerous. Abelard would arrive to find Eloise already waiting, usually with a book in her lap and a question that would spark hours of intense discussion. They'd start with philosophy, drift into theology, veer into poetry, and somehow always end up talking about life, love, and the nature of human desire. The formal boundary between teacher and student had dissolved completely, replaced by something that felt more like intellectual courtship. And Canon Fulbert, he was absolutely delighted with how well the arrangement was working. His beloved niece was clearly thriving under Abelard's instruction, becoming even more articulate and insightful than before. When visitors came to the house and met Eloise, they were invariably impressed by her knowledge and sophistication. Fulbert basked in the reflected glory, convinced he had made the perfect choice in hiring the great master Abelard. He had no idea that his perfect choice was slowly falling apart every time he looked at his student. The shift from intellectual attraction to physical desire was so gradual that neither Abelard nor Eloise could pinpoint exactly when it happened. Maybe it was the morning when Eloise leaned over his shoulder to read a passage, and he caught the scent of lavender in her hair. Maybe it was the afternoon when she laughed at one of his dry observations, and he realized he'd been unconsciously trying to make her laugh for weeks. Or maybe it was the day when their hands accidentally touched while reaching for the same book, and instead of pulling away, they both let the contact linger for just a moment too long. What we do know, from Abelard's own later writings, is that by April of 1116, he was completely obsessed. He wrote, "I could no longer concentrate on my lectures at the cathedral school. My mind was perpetually occupied with thoughts of her wit, her beauty, her fierce intelligence. I found myself counting the hours until our next lesson like a lovesick boy." And here's where the story gets really interesting, because Eloise was just as affected, but she was handling it very differently. Remember, she was 17 years old, brilliant beyond her years, and had spent her entire life being told that her mind was her greatest asset, while her physical desires were supposed to be irrelevant. Now she was discovering that intellectual passion and physical attraction weren't separate things at all. They were feeding off each other, creating something more powerful than either would have been alone. In one of her later letters, she described this period with startling honesty. "I knew what was happening between us, and I knew where it would lead. I was not the innocent victim that people later portrayed me as. I was a willing participant in my own seduction, perhaps even the architect of it. Because here's the truth that makes this story so much more complex than a simple case of a powerful man taking advantage of a young student. Eloise was actively participating in the dance of attraction. She was intelligent enough to understand the game they were playing, sophisticated enough to know the rules, and confident enough to play by her own. The turning point came on a warm afternoon in late April. They'd been debating the nature of divine love versus earthly love, a topic that had become increasingly personal for both of them. Abelard was arguing for the superiority of spiritual connection, while Eloise was making the case that physical desire could be a path to understanding the divine. You speak of earthly love as though you have experience with it, Abelard said, trying to keep his tone academic. But surely your knowledge is purely theoretical. Heloise looked at him with those penetrating eyes that seemed to see straight through to his soul. And what about your knowledge, master? Is your understanding of desire purely theoretical as well? The question hung in the air between them like a challenge, and in that moment, all pretense fell away. They weren't teacher and student anymore, weren't discussing abstract philosophical concepts. They were a man and woman who had been circling each other for months, finally acknowledging the attraction that had been building between them. Eloise, Abelard said, and her name sounded different coming from his lips, softer, more intimate. I know, she whispered. I know what you're thinking. I know what you're feeling. Because I'm feeling it too. What happened next would depend on which account you read. Later chroniclers, trying to preserve everyone's reputation, would write about a gradual courtship, a slow building of appropriate romantic feelings. But the truth, pieced together from their own letters and contemporary accounts, is much more human and much more passionate. They kissed, right there in that sunny study room, surrounded by books and philosophical treatises. Peter Abelard and Eloise finally gave in to months of mounting desire and kissed each other with all the pent-up passion of two brilliant people who had found their perfect match. And once that barrier was broken, there was no going back. The affair that followed was unlike anything either of them had experienced before. This wasn't just physical attraction, though the chemistry between them was explosive. This wasn't just intellectual connection, though their minds were perfectly matched. This was something that combined both elements into something that felt almost supernatural in its intensity. They began meeting in secret, finding excuses to spend more time together. Abelard would arrive early for lessons, claiming he needed to prepare materials. Heloise would ask her uncle for permission to extend their study sessions, saying she needed extra help with particularly difficult concepts. Fulber, delighted by his niece's apparent dedication to learning, gladly agreed to every request. The irony is breathtaking. Every time Fulber praised Abelard for being such a dedicated teacher, every time he commented on how much time and attention the great scholar was giving to Heloise's education, he was unknowingly celebrating the very thing that was destroying his trust and his family's honor. Their secret affair became the worst-kept secret in medieval Paris, at least among those who bothered to pay attention. Servants whispered about the way Master Abelard looked at the young lady, and how she blushed when he spoke to her. Other scholars noticed that Abelard seemed distracted during his public lectures, less sharp in debates, more prone to daydreaming, but perhaps most tellingly, Abelard's own writing from this period shows a dramatic shift in style and subject matter. The man who had spent his career analyzing abstract logical problems suddenly began composing love poetry, and not just any love poetry, some of the most beautiful, passionate verses in medieval literature. He wrote songs about Eloise that became popular throughout Paris, though most people didn't realize who they were about. Young men would sing his compositions in taverns and on street corners, never knowing they were celebrating the secret affair between their favorite teacher and his student. Meanwhile, Heloise was experiencing her own transformation. The intellectual confidence she'd always possessed was now matched by a kind of feminine power she'd never known she had. She discovered that she could make this brilliant, accomplished man lose his train of thought with a single look. She could reduce the most articulate speaker in Europe to stammering with a well-timed smile, for a young woman who had spent her life being valued primarily for her mind. The discovery that she could affect someone so profoundly on both intellectual and physical levels was intoxicating. But power, especially the kind that comes from secret knowledge and hidden desire, is always dangerous. And as spring turned towards summer, both Abelard and Eloise were about to discover just how high the stakes really were in the game they'd been playing. Because Canon Fulbert, for all his trusting nature, wasn't actually blind. He was beginning to notice things. The way his niece glowed after her lessons, the way Abelard's eyes followed her when he thought no one was looking, the subtle changes in the atmosphere of his own house. And when a powerful man in medieval Paris starts to suspect that his honor and his family's reputation are being threatened, the consequences can be swift, brutal, and absolutely devastating. The question wasn't whether their secret would be discovered. The question was what would happen when the reckoning finally came. By the summer of 1116, Peter Abelard and Eloise had created their own private world within the walls of Canon Fulbert's house. What had started as tutoring sessions had evolved into something that can only be described as one of the most passionate love affairs in recorded history. But here's the thing about secret affairs. They're never as secret as the participants think they are. The signs were everywhere, if you knew how to look for them. Abelard, once famous for his sharp wit and devastating debate skills, had become noticeably distracted during his public lectures at Notre Dame. Students who had travelled hundreds of miles to study under the great master found themselves listening to a man whose mind seemed to be somewhere else entirely. His fellow scholars began to whisper. Master William of Champeaux, whom Abelard had so thoroughly humiliated years earlier, was particularly gleeful as he watched his former tormentor stumble through basic logical arguments that he should have been able to recite in his sleep. It seems our brilliant colleague has found something more interesting than philosophy to occupy his thoughts, William remarked to anyone who would listen. Though what could possibly distract a mind as supposedly superior as his? Meanwhile, the love songs that Abelard had begun composing were spreading through Paris like wildfire. Minstrels sang them in taverns. Young lovers whispered them to each other in dark corners, and even serious scholars found themselves humming the melodies. The verses were so beautiful, so filled with genuine passion, that people couldn't help but wonder. Who was the mysterious woman who had inspired such poetry from the man who had never shown the slightest interest in romance? One song in particular became incredibly popular throughout the city. Translated from the original Latin, it went something like this. In her eyes I find wisdom. In her voice I hear music. In her thoughts I discover worlds I never knew existed. She's both teacher and student, both question and answer, both the beginning and end of all my searching. People loved the romance of it, but they also found it puzzling. This didn't sound like the kind of courtly love poetry that knights wrote about distant, unattainable ladies. This sounded personal, intimate, like it was written about someone the poet knew very well indeed. Back in the Fulbert household, the atmosphere was becoming increasingly charged. What had once been a perfectly respectable arrangement, a distinguished scholar tutoring a nobleman's niece, was now something that would have scandalized medieval Paris if the full truth had been known. Their lessons had moved far beyond the formal curriculum Fulbert had originally envisioned. Instead of basic rhetoric and logic, Abelard and Eloise spent their time exploring the deepest questions of human existence, often using their own relationship as a case study. They debated whether love was compatible with reason, whether physical desire enhanced or corrupted intellectual connection, whether two people could truly become one mind while remaining separate bodies. But it wasn't just intellectual anymore. The physical chemistry between them had become undeniable, and the privacy of their study sessions provided ample opportunity for that chemistry to express itself. In his later confessions, Abelard wrote with startling honesty, "Our books lay open before us, but our attention was on each other. We spoke of philosophy, but our hands explored territory that had nothing to do with academic learning. Heloise, for her part, was discovering aspects of herself she'd never imagined. The young woman who had always been valued primarily for her mind was learning that she possessed other forms of power as well. She could make this brilliant, accomplished man completely lose his composure with a single touch. She could reduce the most articulate speaker in Europe to incoherent whispers with the right kind of smile. In one of her letters from this period, she wrote, "I felt like I was awakening to myself for the first time, not just as a mind that could think, but as a complete person who could feel, desire, love, and be loved in return. It was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure." The dangerous part wasn't just that they were having an affair. The dangerous part was how completely they had lost themselves in each other. Abelard, who had spent his entire adult life maintaining perfect self-control, found himself unable to concentrate on anything that didn't involve Heloise. His reputation, his career, his standing in the academic community. None of it seemed to matter anymore compared to the hours he spent with her. And then, in late summer of 1116, everything changed. Heloise realized she was pregnant. Imagine the shock of that discovery. In medieval times, pregnancy outside of marriage wasn't just a social scandal. It was a catastrophe that could destroy lives, end careers, and bring shame on entire families. For a young woman from a noble family, it could mean complete social exile. For a man in Abelard's position, it could mean the end of everything he had worked to achieve. But here's what makes this story so remarkable. Neither of them panicked. Instead, they made a decision that was either incredibly brave or incredibly foolish, depending on your perspective. They decided to face the consequences together. Heloise told Abelard about the pregnancy during one of their morning sessions. According to his later account, her words were simple and direct. "Peter, I'm carrying your child." The room fell silent. Everything they had been building toward, everything they had been avoiding thinking about, was suddenly unavoidable. The game they'd been playing had real consequences, and those consequences were about to arrive in approximately 7 months. Abelard's first instinct was to calculate. How long did they have before the pregnancy became obvious? What options did they have? Could they somehow manage the situation without destroying both their lives? But Heloise's reaction was different, and it reveals something profound about her character. She wasn't afraid. She wasn't ashamed. If anything, she seemed almost relieved that their secret was finally going to be forced into the open. "Are you angry?" she asked him. Abelard looked at this remarkable young woman. Brilliant, beautiful, brave enough to face an uncertain future without flinching, and realized that anger was the last thing he felt. "No," he said. "I'm not angry. I'm terrified, but I'm not angry." They spent the rest of that day planning. They couldn't hide the pregnancy indefinitely, but they could control how and when the truth came out. They could try to minimize the damage, protect Heloise's reputation as much as possible, and figure out a way to build a life together despite the scandal that was coming. The plan they came up with was audacious, romantic, and completely reckless. They would elope. They would leave Paris in secret, travel to Brittany where Abelard's family lived, and get married before the baby was born. It wouldn't eliminate the scandal entirely, but it would legitimize their relationship and their child. It was a plan that required them to abandon everything. Abelard's position at Notre Dame, Heloise's comfortable life with her uncle, their standing in Parisian society. But as they sat in that sunlit study room, surrounded by the books and manuscripts that had brought them together, neither of them seemed to care about what they were giving up. They were young. They were brilliant. They were completely in love, and they were about to discover that sometimes being right about your feelings isn't enough to protect you from the consequences of acting on them. The preparations for their escape began immediately. Abelard arranged for a trusted friend to provide horses and supplies. Eloise began discreetly packing her most valuable possessions. They planned to leave in early autumn, when Abelard's absence from his teaching duties might not be immediately noticed. But here's the thing about secrets in medieval Paris. They have a way of getting out, no matter how careful you think you're being. And Canon Fulbert, despite his trusting nature, was starting to notice things that didn't quite add up. The way his niece glowed with a kind of happiness he'd never seen before. The way she seemed to know things about Abelard's thoughts and opinions that went far beyond what any student should know about their teacher. The way the two of them looked at each other when they thought he wasn't watching. As summer faded into autumn and Eloise's pregnancy progressed, the tension in the household became almost unbearable. They were living on borrowed time, and everyone involved seemed to sense that something was about to break. The question wasn't whether Canon Fulber would discover the truth about his niece and her tutor. The question was what would happen when he did, and whether two people who'd been brave enough to risk everything for love would be strong enough to survive the storm that was coming. October 1116 brought the kind of crisp autumn air that makes secrets feel impossible to keep, and on one particular morning, as golden leaves swirled through the streets of Paris, Eloise stood in front of her mirror and realized that her secret was about to tell itself. The pregnancy could no longer be hidden. Her body was changing in ways that loose clothing and careful posture couldn't disguise much longer. She and Abelard had perhaps 2 weeks, maybe 3 at most, before Canon Fulber would notice what was happening to his beloved niece. It was time to run. The escape plan they had crafted was elegant in its simplicity. Abelard would leave first, claiming he needed to visit his family in Brittany on urgent business. A few days later, Heloise would follow, telling her uncle she was going to stay with distant relatives in the countryside for her health. They would meet at a small inn halfway between Paris and Le Palais, Abelard's hometown, and from there they would travel together to his family's estate. What they hadn't counted on was how difficult it would be to act normal during those final days in Paris. Every conversation with Fulbert felt like a lie. Every meal together was tainted by the knowledge of what they were planning. Every time Eloise caught her uncle looking at her with paternal pride and affection, she felt a stab of guilt that nearly broke her resolve. But there was no turning back now. The baby growing inside her made that impossible. On October the 15th, 1116, Peter Abelard told his students at Notre Dame that he would be taking a brief leave of absence for family matters. He packed a simple traveling bag, arranged for a horse, and rode out of Paris just as the morning mist was lifting from the sea. 3 days later, on a grey dawn that seemed to mirror the emotional weight of what she was doing, Eloise slipped out of her uncle's house while he was at morning prayers. She had left a letter explaining that she needed time in the country to recover from a minor illness, and that she would return within a month. She had no intention of ever returning. The journey to their meeting place should have taken less than a day, but Eloise had never travelled alone before, and the roads between Paris and Brittany were notoriously dangerous for a young woman. She wrapped herself in a heavy cloak and pulled the hood low over her face, hoping to pass for a young man or at least attract as little attention as possible. When she finally reached the inn where they had agreed to meet, she found Abelard waiting for her, pacing anxiously in the courtyard. The relief on his face when he saw her safe arrival was so profound that she almost broke down crying right there. "I was beginning to think you'd changed your mind," he said, taking her hands in his. "Never," she replied. "Though I think my uncle suspects something. He kept asking questions about my illness that I couldn't answer properly." They spent that night in separate rooms at the inn, maintaining propriety even as they planned their future together. But the next morning, as they continued their journey toward Brittany, they were no longer teacher and student, master and ward. They were simply Peter and Eloise, two people who had risked everything for love. The 5-day journey to Le Palais gave them their first real taste of what life together might be like. Away from the constraints and expectations of Paris, they could finally be themselves completely. They talked for hours as their horses carried them through the French countryside, sharing dreams and fears and plans for their future. Abelard told her about his family, his father Berenger, who still couldn't quite understand why his eldest son had chosen books over battles, and his mother Lucia, who would probably adore Eloise once she got over the shock of how her son had acquired a wife. Eloise shared her own anxieties about leaving behind the only life she'd ever known, and starting over in a place where no one knew her reputation or her accomplishments. But despite their concerns, there was an underlying joy to those days on the road. For the first time since their affair had begun, they could touch each other freely, speak openly about their feelings, and plan a future without secrecy or shame. When they finally arrived at the Abelard family estate in Le Palais, the reception was everything they had hoped for and feared. Berenger was initially stunned into silence by his son's unexpected arrival, with a pregnant young woman in tow. But once Abelard explained the situation, carefully editing some of the more scandalous details, his parents welcomed Eloise with warmth and acceptance. Lucia, in particular, was delighted to finally have a daughter-in-law, and one who could match her son's intellect at that. She immediately began making plans for the wedding, the baby's arrival, and Eloise's integration into the family. The wedding itself took place in late October, in the small chapel on the Abelard estate. It was a simple ceremony, attended only by family members and a few close friends who could be trusted to keep the secret, until the couple was ready to announce their marriage publicly. Standing there in that ancient stone chapel, watching Eloise speak her vows with quiet dignity and fierce determination, Abelard felt something he had never experienced before: complete contentment. All his life, he had been driven by ambition, by the need to prove himself, by the hunger for intellectual conquest. But in that moment, holding Eloise's hands and promising to love and protect her for the rest of his life, he realized that all his previous achievements meant nothing compared to this. For her part, Eloise had never looked more beautiful or more uncertain. She was 18 years old, pregnant, married to a man whose career she might have destroyed, and hundreds of miles from everything familiar. But when she looked at Abelard during the ceremony, her eyes shone with a kind of fierce joy that suggested she regretted nothing. The first few weeks of their marriage were probably the happiest either of them had ever experienced. They lived quietly on the estate, walking through the countryside, reading together in the family library, and planning for their child's arrival. Abelard wrote some of his most beautiful poetry during this period, verses celebrating not just romantic love, but the deeper satisfaction of partnership and mutual understanding. But their honeymoon period couldn't last forever. By November, letters began arriving from Paris, and the news was not good. Canon Fulbert had discovered Eloise's deception within days of her departure. Her carefully crafted story about visiting relatives had fallen apart when he tried to send a messenger to check on her health. When he realized that his beloved niece had essentially vanished, his concern had quickly turned to rage. Worse, people in Paris were beginning to connect Eloise's disappearance with Abelard's sudden absence. The man who'd been so punctual, so reliable in his teaching duties, had simply vanished without proper explanation. Students were asking questions. Fellow scholars were gossiping. The cathedral school was in chaos without its most famous instructor. Then someone, and we still don't know who, told Fulbert about the love songs that had been circulating through Paris all summer. Songs that described a brilliant, beautiful woman who had transformed the singer's understanding of love and life. Songs that could only have been written by someone who knew their subject intimately. The pieces began falling into place in Fulbert's mind. The extended tutoring sessions, the way Heloise had glowed whenever Abelard's name was mentioned, the subtle changes in his niece's behavior over the past months, the pregnancy that she had somehow managed to hide from him until it was too late. By December, Canon Fulber had put together the full picture of what had happened under his own roof. His trusted, respected, supposedly celibate tutor had seduced his innocent niece, gotten her pregnant, and spirited her away from Paris like a common criminal. The betrayal was devastating enough, but the humiliation was even worse. All of Paris was talking about how Canon Fulber had been duped by the great Peter Abelard. The man who had been so proud of his wise decision to hire the best tutor available for his niece was now a laughingstock, the butt of jokes in every tavern and social gathering in the city. And that's when Fulber made a decision that would echo through history. He was going to get his revenge, and that revenge was going to be swift, brutal, and perfectly calibrated to destroy everything Peter Abelard valued most. The letters that reached the newlyweds in Brittany painted a picture of a man consumed by rage and bent on destruction. Fulber wasn't just angry, he was plotting. He was gathering allies, making plans, and preparing to strike back at the man who had dishonored his family. As winter deepened around the Abelard estate, Peter and Eloise realized that their peaceful honeymoon was about to come to a violent end. The question wasn't whether Fulber would find a way to hurt them. The question was how much damage he could do, and whether their love would be strong enough to survive what was coming. Winter in medieval Brittany could be brutally cold, but inside the walls of the Abelard family estate, warmth radiated from an unexpected source. In February of 1117, Eloise gave birth to a son they named Astrolabe, a name that perfectly captured their shared love of learning and their hope for a child who would reach for the stars. If you've ever held a newborn baby, you know that feeling of overwhelming love mixed with terror about the future. Now imagine experiencing that while knowing that powerful enemies are plotting your destruction hundreds of miles away. That was the reality Peter Abelard and Heloise faced as they welcomed their son into a world that had already proven hostile to their love. The birth went well, considering the medical limitations of the 12th century. Heloise, with the same determination she'd shown throughout her pregnancy, endured labor with remarkable strength. When she finally held little Astrolabe in her arms, Abelard wrote later that he witnessed a miracle more profound than any philosophical proof I had ever constructed. For a few precious weeks, they existed in a bubble of new parent bliss. Abelard, who had spent his entire adult life in the abstract world of ideas, discovered the profound joy of practical physical care for another human being. He helped with feedings, sang lullabies in Latin, because of course he did, and spent hours simply watching his son sleep. Heloise, meanwhile, was discovering yet another side of herself. The brilliant scholar who could debate theology with the best minds in Europe was now learning the ancient rhythms of motherhood. She wrote to a friend during this period, "I find that love for a child is different from any other love I have known. It is not based on shared interests or intellectual compatibility. It simply is as natural and necessary as breathing." But even as they reveled in their new roles as parents, they couldn't escape the reality of their situation. Letters from Paris continued to arrive, each one painting a grimmer picture of Canon Fulbert's growing rage and the scandal that was consuming Parisian society. The story of Peter Abelard's secret marriage had spread throughout the intellectual community of Europe. Some scholars were scandalized by his apparent hypocrisy. How could a man who had preached the superiority of intellectual pursuits over physical desires have fallen so completely under the spell of a woman? Others were fascinated by the romantic drama, seeing it as proof that even the greatest minds were subject to the power of love. But for Canon Fulbert, the spreading story was a source of increasing humiliation. Every retelling of the tale made him look more foolish, more naive, more completely duped by the man he had trusted with his most precious possession, his niece's education and virtue. By March of 1117, Fulbert's letters to Brittany had taken on an increasingly threatening tone. He demanded that Abelard return to Paris immediately to face the consequences of his actions. He insisted that the marriage be publicly acknowledged, which would destroy Abelard's career at the cathedral school where celibacy was effectively required for advancement. Most ominously, he began making threats about what would happen if Abelard continued to hide in Brittany like a coward. Medieval justice was harsh and often personal, and Fulber had both the connections and the motivation to make Abelard's life very difficult. The couple faced an impossible choice. They could stay in Brittany, safe but essentially in exile, watching Abelard's reputation and career crumble from a distance. Or they could return to Paris and try to manage the crisis, knowing they would be walking into a trap set by a man consumed with rage and humiliation. The decision was ultimately made for them by practicality. Abelard's family, while loving and supportive, couldn't afford to support 3 additional people indefinitely, and Abelard himself was going stir-crazy without his teaching responsibilities and intellectual challenges. He had been born for academic combat, and hiding in the countryside was slowly killing his spirit. So in April of 1117, they made the fateful decision to return to Paris. The plan they developed was as clever as it was risky. They would not return together, which would only inflame Fulber's anger further. Instead, Heloise and baby Astrolabe would go first, and she would throw herself on her uncle's mercy. She would claim that she had been seduced against her will, that Abelard had taken advantage of her youth and innocence. She would beg for forgiveness and promise to submit to whatever punishment Fulbert deemed appropriate. The idea was that Fulber's love for his niece would overcome his desire for revenge. Once Eloise was safely back in his good graces, she could work to moderate his anger toward Abelard and possibly broker some kind of peace agreement. Abelard would follow a few weeks later, ready to face whatever consequences awaited him, but hoping that Eloise's intervention would have softened Fulber's rage. It was a reasonable plan, based on their understanding of Fulber's character and his genuine love for Heloise. What they didn't fully grasp was how much the months of public humiliation had changed him. The kindly, trusting uncle who had welcomed Abelard into his home no longer existed. In his place was a man whose wounded pride had hardened into something much more dangerous. When Eloise arrived at her uncle's house in late April, carrying her infant son, the reunion was nothing like what she'd hoped for. Fulber received her coldly, barely acknowledging the baby who was, after all, his own grandnephew. Instead of the emotional reconciliation she had expected, she found herself facing what amounted to an interrogation. Fulber wanted to know everything. When the affair had started, how long it had continued, whether other people in Paris had known about it, and most importantly, where Peter Abelard was now, and when he planned to return. Heloise tried to stick to their agreed-upon story, portraying herself as an innocent victim who had been manipulated by an older, more experienced man. But Fulber had spent months piecing together the truth, and he wasn't buying her performance. "Do you think I'm a fool?" he asked her during one particularly tense conversation. Do you think I don't know that you are an equal partner in this deception? The servants saw how you looked at him. I have copies of the love letters you wrote to each other. You are not some helpless victim, Eloise. You are a willing participant in your own dishonor. The worst part was that he was right. Eloise had been a willing participant, and trying to pretend otherwise felt like a betrayal of everything she and Abelard had meant to each other. But she persisted with the lie, knowing that Abelard's safety might depend on her ability to convince her uncle that she had been manipulated rather than simply in love. What she didn't know was that Fulber had already made his decision about how to handle Peter Abelard. The letters demanding his return to Paris hadn't been about negotiation or reconciliation. They had been about luring him back within reach of Fulber's revenge. And that revenge, when it came, would be more brutal and more personally devastating than anything either Abelard or Eloise could have imagined. By May of 1117, Abelard could no longer stand the separation from his wife and child. Despite receiving increasingly urgent letters from Eloise, warning him that her uncle remained dangerously angry, he decided to return to Paris and face whatever consequences awaited him. He believed, with the confidence of a man who had spent his life solving problems through reason and debate, that he could negotiate his way out of this crisis. He would apologize for the deception, offer to make whatever amends Fulber required, and find a way to rebuild his reputation and his relationship with Eloise's family. He had no idea that Canon Fulber had spent months planning a punishment that would ensure Peter Abelard never again had the power to seduce any man's daughter. A punishment so brutal and so permanent that it would echo through history as one of the most shocking acts of personal revenge in the medieval world. As Abelard rode toward Paris in the spring of 1117, confident in his ability to talk his way out of trouble, he was actually riding toward a trap that would strip him of everything he valued most about himself. And waiting for him in the shadows of the city he loved was a group of men who'd been paid to ensure that the great Peter Abelard would never again be able to threaten any man's honor. The night of May 15th, 1117, began like any other spring evening in medieval Paris. Peter Abelard had been back in the city for just 3 days, staying in modest lodgings near the cathedral school while he attempted to negotiate some kind of reconciliation with Canon Fulber. He had spent the day in meetings with church officials, trying to salvage what remained of his reputation and his career. What he didn't know was that 4 men had been watching his movements, noting his routines, and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Abelard had chosen his lodgings carefully. A small room above a bakery, owned by people who owed him favors and could be trusted to keep his location quiet. The room was simple but comfortable, with a narrow bed, a writing desk, and a window that looked out over the Seine. It was the kind of place where a man could think, write, and plan his next moves without interruption. But privacy, as Abelard was about to discover, could be a double-edged sword. He'd spent the evening working on a letter to Heloise, trying to reassure her that his negotiations with her uncle were progressing better than expected. Fulber had agreed to meet with him the following day, which Abelard interpreted as a positive sign. Surely, he reasoned, if Fulber was willing to talk, they could find a way to resolve this crisis like civilized men. What Abelard didn't understand was that the meeting had never been about reconciliation. It had been about confirming his location and his routine, giving Fulber's hired men the information they needed to plan their attack. Around midnight, as Abelard was finally preparing for sleep, he heard footsteps on the narrow staircase leading to his room. This wasn't unusual. The building creaked and settled throughout the night, and other tenants often came and went at odd hours. But something about these footsteps was different. They were too careful, too measured, the movements of people trying not to be heard. Abelard paused, listening. The footsteps had stopped just outside his door. In his later writings, he described the moment with chilling clarity. I knew, with the certainty that comes from pure instinct, that death or something worse was waiting on the other side of that door. But I also knew there was nowhere to run. The attack, when it came, was swift and brutal. 4 men burst through the door, not common thieves looking for money, but professionals who had been hired for a very specific purpose. They overpowered Abelard before he could even fully understand what was happening, binding his hands and feet with practiced efficiency. What happened next is difficult to describe in detail, partly because of the graphic nature of the assault, and partly because it represents one of the most shocking acts of personal revenge in medieval history. Canon Fulber had chosen a punishment that was perfectly calibrated to destroy everything Peter Abelard valued about himself as a man. They castrated him. In medieval times, castration wasn't just a physical assault. It was a complete destruction of masculine identity. For a man like Abelard, who had built his life around intellectual dominance and personal charisma, the psychological impact was even more devastating than the physical trauma. The attackers left him bleeding and unconscious in his room, confident that their message had been delivered. By dawn, news of the assault was spreading through Paris like wildfire, carried by the baker's wife who had heard the commotion and discovered Abelard's broken body. The reaction throughout the city was immediate and intense. Even people who had criticized Abelard for his affair with Eloise were horrified by the brutality of Fulber's revenge. This wasn't justice. This was savagery. The kind of barbaric act that had no place in civilized society. Church officials rushed to provide medical care, while secular authorities began investigating the attack. But everyone knew who was responsible, even if proving it would be difficult. Canon Fulber had made no secret of his anger, and the precision of the assault left little doubt about its motivation. For several days, Abelard's life hung in the balance. Medieval medicine was primitive at best, and the trauma he had suffered would have killed many men. But somehow, whether through sheer will or divine intervention, he survived. The physical recovery took weeks, but the psychological impact was immediate and devastating. In a single night, Peter Abelard had been transformed from one of the most powerful and charismatic men in Europe into something that medieval society barely recognized as masculine at all. The humiliation was almost unbearable. Throughout Paris, people whispered about what had happened to the great master Abelard. Some expressed sympathy. Others suggested he'd gotten what he deserved. The love songs he had written about Eloise, once celebrated for their passion and beauty, now seemed like cruel reminders of everything he had lost. But perhaps the most devastating aspect of the whole ordeal was its impact on his relationship with Eloise. When news of the attack reached her at her uncle's house, she was consumed by guilt and rage. This had happened because of their love affair, because of choices they had made together. Yet she was powerless to help him, trapped in her uncle's house with their infant son, dependent on the mercy of the man who had ordered this brutal assault. The letters they exchanged during Abelard's recovery reveal the depth of their shared anguish. Heloise wrote, "I would give anything to take this suffering upon myself instead. You have paid a price for our love that no man should have to pay, and I am tormented by the knowledge that I am the cause of your pain." Abelard's responses show a man struggling to maintain his sanity and his sense of self in the face of unimaginable trauma. "Do not blame yourself for what has been done to me," he wrote. "The fault lies with those who chose violence over reason, barbarism over civilization. What we had together was beautiful, and no amount of cruelty can change that truth." But even as he tried to comfort Heloise, Abelard was facing a terrible reality. His career at the cathedral school was over. No institution would employ a castrated man in a position of authority. His reputation as an intellectual giant was forever tainted by the circumstances of his downfall. Most importantly, his relationship with Eloise could never be the same. In medieval society, a castrated man was seen as fundamentally incomplete, neither fully male nor female, existing in a liminal space that made others deeply uncomfortable. The passionate physical relationship that had been such an important part of Abelard and Eloise's connection was now impossible. The children they might have had together, the normal married life they had dreamed of building, all of it had been stolen in a single night of violence. As spring turned towards summer, Abelard faced a choice that would define the rest of his life. He could try to rebuild some version of his old existence, accepting the limitations and humiliations that his new status would bring. Or he could make a radical break with his past and find an entirely new way to live. The decision he made would surprise everyone who knew him, including Eloise, but it would also set the stage for one of the most remarkable transformations in medieval history. The rebirth of Peter Abelard as something entirely different from what he had been before. Canon Fulbert's revenge had been perfectly executed. He had destroyed his enemy's masculinity, his career, and his future. What he hadn't counted on was that sometimes, when you break a person completely, they have the opportunity to rebuild themselves into something stronger than they were before. The question now was whether Peter Abelard had the courage and the wisdom to find meaning and purpose in a life that had been shattered beyond recognition, and whether his love for Eloise could survive a transformation that would separate them not just physically, but spiritually as well. 3 months after the attack that shattered his life, Peter Abelard made a decision that shocked medieval Europe even more than his scandalous love affair had. On a grey August morning in 1117, he walked through the gates of the Abbey of Saint-Denis and announced his intention to become a monk. The transformation was so radical, so unexpected, that many people simply couldn't believe it. This was the man who had spent his entire career arguing for the supremacy of reason over faith, who had challenged church authority at every turn, who had lived as though physical desires and intellectual pursuits could coexist without conflict. Now he was voluntarily entering one of the most restrictive religious communities in France. But here's what makes Abelard's decision so fascinating and so heartbreaking. It wasn't really about finding God. It was about finding a way to disappear. Think about it from his perspective. The man who had once commanded the attention of thousands of students, who'd been celebrated throughout Europe for his brilliance and charisma, was now an object of pity and gossip. Every time he appeared in public, people stared, whispered, remembered what had been done to him. The humiliation was constant and inescapable. In medieval society, there were very few acceptable paths for a castrated man. You could become a court eunuch, serving powerful nobles in roles that required loyalty without the threat of sexual intrigue. You could try to maintain some version of your old life, accepting the limitations and whispers that would follow you everywhere. Or you could enter the church, where celibacy was already expected and your physical condition might actually be seen as an advantage rather than a disability. The Abbey of Saint-Denis was perfect for Abelard's purposes. It was far enough from Paris to provide escape from the constant reminders of his former life, but prestigious enough that his retreat wouldn't look like complete defeat. The Abbey had an excellent library, a tradition of scholarly work, and a reputation for accepting men with complicated pasts. When Abelard appeared at the gates, wearing simple travelling clothes and carrying nothing but a small bag of personal possessions, the monks who received him were initially skeptical. This was, after all, the famous Peter Abelard, a man known for his pride, his intellectual arrogance, and his recent spectacular fall from grace? Was he genuinely seeking spiritual renewal, or was he simply looking for a convenient place to hide? The novice master, Brother Anselm, later wrote about that first interview. He seemed like a man who had died and been brought back to life, but not completely. There was intelligence in his eyes, but no fire. He answered our questions correctly, but without passion. It was as though someone had taken the great Peter Abelard and replaced him with a very convincing copy. The process of becoming a monk in the 12th century was rigorous and demanding. Novices had to surrender all their worldly possessions, take vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, and submit to a life of prayer, work, and study under strict supervision. For most men, it represented a complete transformation of identity and purpose. For Abelard, it represented something even more radical. The chance to become someone entirely different from who he had been before. The physical aspects of monastic life were probably the easiest part of his transition. He had always been disciplined about his personal habits, and the simple food, basic clothing, and modest accommodations of the monastery were not particularly difficult adjustments. If anything, the structure and routine provided a welcome relief from the chaos and uncertainty of his recent life. But the psychological and spiritual aspects of his transformation were much more complex. Abelard had spent his entire adult life as an intellectual celebrity, someone whose opinions mattered, whose ideas shaped debates throughout Europe. Now he was just another monk, expected to follow orders, keep quiet during meals, and spend hours in silent prayer. The strangest part? He seemed to find peace in the anonymity. Brother Anselm observed, "It was remarkable to watch him adapt to our life. The man who had once commanded lecture halls fell silent and remained silent. The scholar who had questioned everything now followed our rules without argument. It was as though he had decided to become the opposite of everything he had once been. But Abelard's intellectual gift couldn't be completely suppressed, even in the confines of monastic life. The abbey's library contained manuscripts that he had never seen before, theological works that raised questions he had never considered. Slowly, almost against his will, he began to engage with the religious scholarship in a way he never had before. The difference was that now, instead of approaching theology as an intellectual exercise designed to show off his cleverness, he was studying it as a man desperately seeking meaning in the ruins of his former life. The questions he asked weren't about winning debates anymore. They were about understanding how a loving God could allow such brutal suffering, how faith and reason could coexist, how a person could find purpose after everything they valued had been stripped away. This new approach to religious study would eventually revolutionize medieval theology, but that was still years in the future. In the summer of 1117, Abelard was simply a broken man trying to figure out how to rebuild himself from the ground up. Meanwhile, the question of what to do about Héloïse was tearing him apart. She was still living in her uncle's house with their son, trapped in a situation that was becoming increasingly unbearable. Fulbert had gotten his revenge against Abelard, but his anger toward his niece hadn't diminished. He blamed her for the scandal that had destroyed his reputation, for the whispers that followed him through Paris, for the way other nobles now looked at him with a mixture of pity and amusement. The letters between Abelard and Héloïse during this period reveal the depth of their shared anguish. She wrote, "I understand why you have chosen the path you have chosen, but it feels like a second death to me. First I lost you to violence, and now I am losing you to God. I know I should be grateful that you have found peace, but I confess that your peace feels like my abandonment." Abelard's responses show a man torn between his love for Héloïse and his need to protect himself from further emotional devastation. I cannot ask you to wait for a man who no longer exists, he wrote. The Peter Abelard you loved is gone, and I do not know who or what I will become in his place. You deserve a life free from the shadows of my destruction. But there was another factor that would soon force a resolution to their impossible situation. Canon Fulbert was growing increasingly uncomfortable with having Eloise and little Astrolabe in his house. The baby was a constant reminder of the scandal, and Eloise's presence was making it difficult for him to rebuild his own reputation in Parisian society. By autumn of 1117, Fulbert was making it clear that his niece needed to find somewhere else to live. He wouldn't throw her out completely, that would be too scandalous even for him, but he was applying pressure for her to make her own arrangements. The solution that emerged was as dramatic as it was inevitable. If Abelard was going to become a monk, then Eloise would become a nun. The idea wasn't entirely without precedent. In medieval times, it wasn't uncommon for married couples to enter religious life together, though usually not under such tragic circumstances. What made this situation unique was that Heloise had no religious calling whatsoever. She was choosing the convent not because she felt drawn to spiritual life, but because it was literally the only option available to her. When Abelard first suggested this solution in a letter, Eloise's response was immediate and devastating. You ask me to take vows that will separate us forever, to dedicate my life to a God who has shown us nothing but cruelty, to pretend that I have found peace in prayer when my heart is still entirely yours. Do you understand what you're asking of me? But what choice did she have? She was an unmarried mother with no independent means of support, living in a society that offered women very few options for autonomous life. The convent would provide security for herself and education for Astrolabe. It would also remove her from the impossible situation with her uncle and give her a respectable identity that didn't depend on her relationship to the men who had controlled her life. Most importantly, it would allow her to maintain some connection to Abelard, even if that connection was mediated through religious vows and institutional separation. And so, in one of the most heartbreaking decisions in medieval history, Heloise agreed to enter the convent of Argenteuil, while their son Astrolabe would be raised by Abelard's family in Brittany. The two people who had risked everything for love were about to take vows that would ensure they could never touch each other again, never share a bed, never even speak privately without violating their religious commitments. But as we'll discover, even the walls of monasteries and convents couldn't completely contain the intellectual and emotional connection between two people who had found in each other the perfect match for their minds and hearts. Silence has a weight to it, especially when it carries the burden of everything you're not allowed to say. For 15 years after entering their respective religious houses, Peter Abelard and Eloise lived in that heavy silence, forbidden by their vows to communicate, each wondering if the other ever thought about the love that had cost them everything. Then, in 1132, everything changed with a single letter. But let me back up and tell you what those 15 years of separation had done to both of them. Because the transformation was remarkable in completely different ways. Abelard, despite his initial reluctance to embrace religious life, had become something unexpected. A revolutionary theologian. The man who had once used his intellect to show off was now using it to ask the most dangerous questions imaginable about faith, reason, and the nature of religious truth. His most controversial work during this period was called Sic et Nol, Yes and No, and it was basically medieval dynamite. Abelard collected contradictory statements from church fathers and biblical sources, then presented them side by side without offering easy resolutions. He was essentially saying, look, even the greatest religious authorities disagree about fundamental questions. Maybe we need to use our reason to figure out what's actually true. You have to understand how radical this was. In 1130, suggesting that reason should be used to examine religious doctrine was like suggesting that democracy might be better than monarchy, technically possible to think, but incredibly dangerous to say out loud. The church hierarchy was simultaneously fascinated and terrified by Abelard's new approach. On one hand, his arguments were brilliant and logically unassailable. On the other hand, they threatened the entire foundation of religious authority. If people started thinking for themselves about theological questions, where would it end? Meanwhile, Abelard was also dealing with something that modern readers will find darkly amusing. He had become famous again, which was exactly what he'd been trying to avoid by becoming a monk. Students began seeking him out at the Abbey of Saint-Denis, eager to study under the legendary scholar who had supposedly found God after losing everything to love. The Abbey, which had expected a quiet, broken man who would pray and keep to himself, suddenly found itself hosting an unofficial university with Peter Abelard as the star attraction. The irony was thick enough to cut with a knife. Abelard had entered the monastery to escape his reputation, but his intellectual gifts were too powerful to remain hidden, even in religious robes, even after everything that had been taken from him. He couldn't stop being exactly what he had always been, a teacher who could make people think in ways they'd never thought before. But what about Eloise? Her transformation was even more remarkable, and in some ways more tragic. The convent of Argenteuil had expected to receive a chastened young woman, grateful for the opportunity to atone for her sins through a life of quiet prayer and submission. Instead, they got an intellectual powerhouse who threw herself into religious administration with the same passion she'd once brought to philosophy. Eloise became the most effective abbess in the region, transforming Argenteuil from a sleepy religious house into a center of learning and economic activity. She established schools for young women, created innovative agricultural programs that made the convent financially independent, and developed a reputation for wisdom and practical intelligence that attracted visitors from throughout France. But here's what makes her story so heartbreaking. She did all of this while nursing a private anguish that never diminished. In her private writings, which weren't discovered until centuries later, she was brutally honest about her lack of religious calling. "I take the sacraments because they are required," she wrote. "I pray because it is my duty. I lead these good women because someone must. And I happen to be competent at organization. But my heart remains unchanged. I am no closer to God than I was as a girl of 17, and perhaps farther away." The most painful part of her situation was that she had become genuinely respected for her religious leadership, while privately feeling like a complete fraud. Everyone praised Abbess Eloise for her spiritual wisdom and devotion, when in reality she was simply a brilliant woman making the best of an impossible situation. She never stopped thinking about Abelard, never stopped wondering what had become of the man she had loved so completely. But their vows, and the scandal that had separated them, made any contact impossible. She didn't even know if he was still alive. And then, in 1132, 15 years after they'd been forced apart, Heloise received a letter that changed everything. It wasn't from Abelard directly. It was a copy of something he had written to a friend, a long autobiographical letter called Historia Calamitatum, or The Story of My Calamities. Someone, knowing about her past connection to Abelard, had thought she might be interested in reading about his experiences. Imagine opening a letter and suddenly seeing your entire life story told from the perspective of the person you had loved most in the world, but hadn't spoken to in 15 years. Imagine reading about your own love affair, your own choices, your own tragedy. described by someone who had shared every moment of it, but might now see it completely differently. Abelard's account was honest, detailed, and devastating. He wrote about their affair with a combination of nostalgia and regret, describing it as the greatest happiness and the greatest mistake of his life. He analyzed their relationship with the same intellectual rigor he brought to theological questions, trying to understand how two intelligent people had made choices that led to such catastrophic consequences. But what struck Heloise most powerfully was his tone. He wrote about their love as something that belonged to the past, something he had moved beyond in his journey towards spiritual enlightenment. He expressed gratitude for the suffering that had led him to God, suggesting that their tragedy had ultimately been a blessing in disguise. For a woman who had spent 15 years privately mourning what they had lost, this perspective was both illuminating and infuriating. Heloise sat in her private chambers at Argenteuil, reading and rereading Abelard's letter, and realized that she had a choice to make. She could continue her life of dignified silence, accepting his apparent spiritual transformation and leaving their past undisturbed. Or she could break 15 years of imposed separation and tell him exactly what she thought about his convenient religious resolution to their earthly love. She chose to write back. The letter she composed was one of the most remarkable documents in medieval literature, a work of devastating honesty, intellectual brilliance, and emotional power that challenged everything Abelard had written about their relationship. You write as though our love was a mistake that you've been fortunate to overcome, she began. You speak of gratitude for the suffering that separated us, as though God arranged our tragedy for our spiritual benefit. But I must tell you honestly, I feel no such gratitude. I regret nothing about what we shared, and I mourn every day for what was taken from us. She went on to dissect his religious interpretation of their story with surgical precision. If God had wanted them to find spiritual truth, she argued, surely there had been gentler ways to guide them toward it. If their love had been sinful, why had it felt so pure, so connected to everything beautiful and meaningful in creation? Most powerfully, she challenged his apparent peace with their separation. You write as though you have found in God a love that surpasses what we shared, but I wonder, have you truly found divine love? Or have you simply convinced yourself that earthly love is inferior because it was taken from you? Would you feel the same spiritual satisfaction if you had been allowed to keep both your relationship with God and your relationship with me? The letter was everything that 15 years of forced religious conformity had not allowed her to say. It was angry, passionate, intellectually rigorous, and completely unrepentant. It was, in short, vintage Heloise, the same brilliant woman who had first captured Abelard's heart by refusing to accept conventional wisdom without examining it herself. When Abelard received her letter, his carefully constructed spiritual peace was shattered completely. The woman he thought he had successfully relegated to his past was very much alive, very much unchanged, and very much unconvinced by his religious transformation. More importantly, her letter forced him to confront a question he had been avoiding for 15 years. Had he really found peace with God? Or had he simply found an elaborate way to hide from the pain of losing the only person who had ever truly understood him? The correspondence that followed would become one of the greatest exchanges of letters in literary history, a philosophical and emotional exploration of love, loss, faith, and the nature of human connection that still resonates today. But it would also reopen wounds that both of them had spent 15 years trying to heal. When Abelard read Heloise's letter, he experienced something he hadn't felt in 15 years, complete emotional honesty from the person who knew him best. Her words stripped away every comfortable lie he had told himself about finding peace, about spiritual fulfillment, about moving beyond earthly attachments. She'd seen right through his carefully constructed religious persona and called him out with the precision of a master surgeon. His response, when it finally came, was unlike anything he had written during his years as a monk. Gone was the detached, philosophical tone he had adopted in his religious writings. In its place was something raw, honest, and deeply human. You ask whether I have truly found divine love or simply convinced myself that earthly love is inferior because it was taken from me. He wrote, "The question haunts me because I fear you may be right. I have spent 15 years building a fortress of religious rationalization around the simple truth that losing you nearly destroyed me. What followed was a correspondence that would span nearly 3 years and produce some of the most beautiful, complex, and psychologically penetrating letters in human history. These weren't just love letters. They were philosophical explorations of the deepest questions about human nature, divine purpose, and the relationship between earthly and spiritual love." Heloise wrote with the passion and intellect that had first captivated Abelard, but now refined by years of practical experience running a religious community. She challenged his theological conclusions not just emotionally, but intellectually, forcing him to defend positions that she found logically inconsistent. "You claim that God arranged our suffering to lead us to spiritual truth," she wrote in one particularly devastating passage. "But this suggests either that God is cruel enough to use innocent people as instruments of punishment, or that our love was so sinful it required divine intervention to stop it. I reject both conclusions. Our love was the most pure and honest thing either of us had ever experienced. If God punished us for it, then perhaps we need to question our understanding of God." This was dangerous territory for both of them. In medieval times, questioning divine justice wasn't just intellectually risky, it could be considered heretical. But Heloise had moved beyond caring about religious correctness. She was more interested in truth than in safety. Abelard found himself intellectually energized in a way he hadn't been since their original tutoring sessions. Her letters forced him to think more rigorously about questions he had been content to answer with conventional religious formulas. More importantly, they reminded him of what he had lost when their relationship ended. Not just physical intimacy, but intellectual partnership with someone who could challenge him at the highest level. "I realize now," he wrote, "that I have spent 15 years trying to replace you with God, rather than finding a way to love both you and God simultaneously. Perhaps the real sin was not our love, but my assumption that human and divine love must be mutually exclusive." As their correspondence continued, both of them began to evolve beyond the positions they had held at the beginning. Heloise started to find genuine meaning in religious life, not because she had developed conventional piety, but because she had discovered that spiritual leadership could be a form of intellectual and moral expression. Running the convent had taught her that caring for others could be as satisfying as caring for ideas. Meanwhile, Abelard was rediscovering the possibility of emotional engagement without compromising his religious commitments. Their letters allowed him to love Heloise in a new way, as an intellectual companion and spiritual friend rather than a romantic partner. It wasn't the same as what they had shared before, but it was real, meaningful, and sustainable within their current circumstances. But perhaps the most remarkable development was how their renewed connection began to transform their work in their respective religious communities. Heloise, energized by her intellectual exchanges with Abelard, began developing innovative approaches to religious education for women. She wrote treatises on practical theology, that combined rigorous scholarship with accessible language, making complex ideas available to people who had never had formal education. Her work at Argenteuil became a model for other convents throughout France. Abelard, meanwhile, was experiencing a creative renaissance. His renewed correspondence with Héloïse had reminded him of the joy of intellectual collaboration, and he began developing new theological methods that would influence religious scholarship for centuries. His synthesis of faith and reason, first attempted years earlier, now took on a depth and nuance that reflected his personal experience of loss, redemption, and renewed purpose. The irony was beautiful. Their separation had forced them to become more fully themselves as individuals, and their reunion through letters allowed them to support each other's growth in ways that might not have been possible if they had remained together as a conventional married couple. But their correspondence wasn't without its challenges. Both of them struggled with moments of profound sadness about what they had lost. Héloïse wrote movingly about watching other women with their children and thinking about little Astrolabe, now a young man being educated by Abelard's family in Brittany. Abelard confessed that he sometimes woke up forgetting where he was, expecting to find her beside him, as he had during those brief months of marriage. Yet somehow, they found a way to transform their grief into something productive. Their letters became a laboratory for exploring how human beings could love deeply while accepting the limitations imposed by circumstances beyond their control. "I have learned," Héloïse wrote in one of her most profound passages, "that love is not diminished by obstacles, but rather refined by them. What we have now is different from what we once shared, but it is no less real or meaningful. Perhaps this is what spiritual love actually means, not the absence of earthly feeling, but the transformation of earthly feeling into something that can transcend physical presence." Abelard's response showed how much their renewed connection had changed his understanding of religious life. "You have taught me that running away from human love is not the path to divine love. Rather, learning to love another person completely, with all their complexity, their intelligence, their independence, prepares us to understand how God might love us. Our relationship has become my theological education." Their letters also reveal something beautiful about intellectual partnership. Even separated by distance and religious vows, they continued to challenge, inspire, and teach each other. Their correspondence shows two brilliant minds working together to solve problems, explore ideas, and create new understanding. By 1135, both of them had achieved something remarkable. They had found a way to be together that honored both their past love and their present commitments. They weren't trying to recreate what they had lost, but they had discovered something new and valuable in its place. More importantly, they had both become more influential and accomplished than they might have been if their original plans had worked out. Abelard's theological innovations were reshaping how people thought about faith and reason throughout Europe. Héloïse's practical reforms were improving religious life for women across France. Their tragedy had somehow transformed into triumph, not because they had found conventional happiness, but because they had learned to create meaning and purpose from the materials of their broken dreams. But just as their relationship was reaching this new equilibrium, external forces were about to intervene once again. The same intellectual boldness that had made Abelard famous was about to make him dangerous, and the church authorities who had tolerated his innovations were preparing to silence him permanently. The question was whether the love and support he'd rediscovered with Héloïse would be enough to sustain him through the final crisis of his extraordinary life. Love has a strange way of making people brave, even when they should probably be more careful. By 1140, the intellectual renaissance that Abelard and Héloïse had sparked through their correspondence was drawing dangerous attention from the very highest levels of church authority. And once again, Peter Abelard was about to discover that being brilliant doesn't necessarily protect you from being destroyed. The problem wasn't that Abelard had become less controversial during his years as a monk. If anything, his theological innovations had become more radical, more challenging to established authority. The difference was that now he had support from someone who understood him completely. And that support had made him bold in ways that would ultimately prove both inspiring and catastrophic. Heloise had become more than just his correspondent. She had become his intellectual collaborator and strategic advisor. Through their letters, she helped him refine his arguments, anticipate objections, and present his ideas in ways that were logically unassailable. Her practical experience running a religious community had taught her how church politics worked, and she used that knowledge to help Abelard navigate the increasingly treacherous waters of theological debate. But their very success was creating powerful enemies. Bernard of Clairvaux, one of the most influential religious figures of the 12th century, had been watching Abelard's growing influence with increasing alarm. Bernard represented the old school of religious thought. Faith should be accepted without question. Church authority should never be challenged, and intellectual pride was one of the most dangerous sins a person could commit. To Bernard, Peter Abelard represented everything wrong with contemporary religious life. Here was a man who had been publicly humiliated for his moral failures, who should have spent the rest of his life in grateful silence, instead becoming more influential than ever by encouraging people to think for themselves about religious questions. The final confrontation began in 1140, when Bernard convinced Pope Innocent II to call a church council at Sens to examine Abelard's teachings. This wasn't supposed to be a trial, officially. It was just a theological discussion where Abelard would have the opportunity to explain and defend his ideas. In reality, it was a carefully orchestrated attack designed to silence him permanently. Heloise saw the trap immediately. In one of her letters from this period, she wrote, "They are not inviting you to defend your ideas. They are inviting you to watch while they destroy them. Bernard has already decided you are guilty. The council is just theatre to make your condemnation look official." She begged Abelard to avoid the council entirely, to plead illness or find some other excuse to stay away. She understood that this wasn't really about theology. It was about power, and whether the church would tolerate intellectual independence from its members. But Abelard, energized by years of successful correspondence and theological work, believed he could win any debate through the sheer force of logic and evidence. He had spent his entire life proving that brilliant arguments could overcome any opposition. Why should this be different? "I will not run from a theological discussion," he wrote back to Heloise. "If my ideas cannot withstand scrutiny, then they do not deserve to survive. But if they are true, then no amount of political maneuvering can ultimately defeat them." It was a noble position and completely naive. The Council of Sens, held in June 1140, was everything Heloise had predicted it would be. Abelard arrived expecting a scholarly debate, and found instead a show trial where the verdict had been predetermined. Bernard had prepared a list of 19 propositions allegedly drawn from Abelard's writings, each one presented in the most heretical possible interpretation. When Abelard tried to explain the context of these statements, to show how they had been taken out of context or misrepresented, he was cut off and told that the time for explanation had passed. When he attempted to engage in the kind of logical discussion that had made him famous, he was accused of intellectual pride and disrespect for church authority. The most heartbreaking part of the entire proceedings was watching this brilliant man realize that everything he had believed about the power of reason and evidence was useless. in a political context where the outcome had been decided in advance. By the end of the first day, Abelard understood that he had been completely outmaneuvered. This wasn't a theological discussion. It was a public humiliation designed to warn anyone else who might be tempted to challenge church authority. That night, he wrote what would be his final letter to Eloise as a free man. You were right about everything, and I was a fool to think that truth alone could protect me. They do not want to debate my ideas. They want to make an example of me. I am sorry that my pride has brought this final disaster upon us both. Eloise's response, written immediately upon receiving his letter, shows the full power of her love and her strategic intelligence. Do not apologize for being who you are. Your ideas are valuable whether or not they are officially approved. Your influence on religious thought will survive whatever they do to you personally. But more importantly, you must remember that you are more than your public reputation. You are a man I have loved for 25 years, and that love does not depend on the approval of church councils. The next morning, in a move that shocked everyone present, Abelard stood up before the council could reconvene and announced that he was appealing directly to Pope Innocent II. Then he walked out of the proceedings entirely, refusing to participate in what he now understood to be a sham trial. It was a dramatic gesture, but ultimately futile. Bernard's influence with the Pope was overwhelming, and within weeks, Innocent II had condemned Abelard's teachings and ordered him to cease all theological writing and teaching. At age 61, Peter Abelard was essentially sentenced to intellectual death. He was forbidden from expressing the ideas that had defined his life's work, forbidden from teaching the students who sought him out, forbidden from participating in the theological discussions that had been his greatest joy. But here's where the story takes on an almost mythical quality. Instead of being crushed by this final defeat, Abelard found a kind of peace that had eluded him throughout his dramatic life. He retired to the Abbey of Cluny under the protection of Abbot Peter the Venerable, who had enough influence to keep him safe from further persecution. There, in the quiet of genuine monastic life, he spent his final years not fighting theological battles, but simply living as a monk who happened to have once been famous. Heloise continued to write to him, and her letters from this period show a woman who had finally found a way to love someone completely, without needing to possess them or control their destiny. She had learned, through years of separation and reunion, that love could survive any external circumstances if both people were willing to adapt and grow. I am proud of you, she wrote in one of her last letters to him, not because you were famous or brilliant or influential, but because you never stopped being authentically yourself, even when being yourself brought you nothing but trouble. That authenticity is what I fell in love with when I was 17, and it is what I love about you now. In 1142, Peter Abelard died quietly at Cluny, surrounded by monks who respected him not for his controversial ideas, but for his genuine humility and kindness during his final years. He was 63 years old and had lived one of the most dramatically eventful lives in medieval history. When news of his death reached Heloise at the Paraclete, the convent she had established using principles she and Abelard had developed together, she wrote a final letter that was never sent, but was found among her papers after her own death 22 years later. My dearest Peter, it began, you were the great love of my life, but you were also something more precious. You were my teacher, my intellectual companion, and my dearest friend. We shared a love that survived scandal, separation, religious vows, and political persecution. If that is not a kind of immortality, then I do not know what immortality means. And as we'll discover in our final moments together, the story of Peter Abelard and Eloise didn't end with death. Their letters, their ideas, and their demonstration that intellectual and emotional love could coexist and strengthen each other would influence how people thought about love, learning, and human potential for centuries to come. Sometimes the most powerful love stories are the ones that transcend death itself. And in the case of Peter Abelard and Eloise, their greatest triumph wasn't in life, it was in how their story refused to die, becoming instead a beacon of hope for anyone who has ever believed that love and intellect could change the world. When Eloise received word of Abelard's death in 1142, she was 54 years old and had become one of the most respected religious leaders in France, the Paraclete. The convent she had founded using principles she and Abelard had developed together was thriving under her leadership. She had created something unprecedented, a religious community where women could pursue intellectual achievement alongside spiritual development. But losing Abelard, even after all those years of separation, felt like losing a part of herself. In her private writing from this period, she described grief as a teacher I never wanted but cannot dismiss. She threw herself into her work with even greater intensity, as though completing their shared vision could somehow honor his memory. What Eloise accomplished in the 22 years after Abelard's death was extraordinary. She established schools that educated both noble and common women, created economic systems that made religious communities financially independent, and wrote treatises on education that influenced how people thought about learning for centuries. Most importantly, she preserved and copied their correspondence, ensuring that their letters would survive to inspire future generations. She understood, with the clarity that comes from profound loss, that their love story contained lessons that transcended their personal tragedy. When Eloise died in 1164, she was buried next to Abelard at the Paraclete. According to legend, when her coffin was lowered into the ground, Abelard's arms opened to receive her. Whether you believe that story or not, there's something beautiful about the idea that even death couldn't separate two people who had been so perfectly matched intellectually and emotionally. But here's what makes their story truly immortal: the ideas they developed together, the questions they asked, and the example they set of intellectual partnership continue to influence the world long after they were gone. Their correspondence became one of the most widely copied texts of the medieval period. Young scholars throughout Europe read their letters and learned that it was possible to combine rigorous thinking with passionate feeling, that intellectual achievement and emotional depth could strengthen rather than weaken each other. The theological methods Abelard developed, refined through his discussions with Eloise, helped lay the groundwork for what would become medieval scholasticism, the systematic approach to religious study that dominated European universities for centuries. Thomas Aquinas, one of the greatest theologians in Christian history, built directly on foundations that Abelard had established. Heloise's innovations in religious education for women were equally influential. The schools she established became models for female education throughout medieval Europe. She proved that women could be intellectual leaders, effective administrators, and innovative thinkers when given the opportunity and support. But perhaps their most important legacy was something more subtle but more powerful. They demonstrated that true love, the kind that combines intellectual respect with emotional connection, could survive any external circumstances if both people were willing to grow and adapt. Think about what they accomplished together. They transformed a scandalous affair into a philosophical exploration of the deepest questions about human nature. They turned personal tragedy into intellectual innovation. They created a love story that has inspired artists, writers, and thinkers for 900 years. Alexander Pope, the great English poet, wrote about them. Abelard and Eloise, still vibrant chords of death's harp we hear, and sighs, forever fresh, their sad names bear. Romantic poets like Lord Byron saw in their story a perfect example of love that transcended social conventions. Modern feminists have celebrated Eloise as an early example of a woman who refused to be silenced or diminished by the men around her. Their story has been retold in countless novels, poems, plays, and films. But what's remarkable is how each generation finds something different to admire in their relationship. Medieval audiences saw it as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked passion. Renaissance writers emphasized the romantic tragedy. Enlightened thinkers focused on their intellectual achievements. Modern readers are often most struck by their ability to create partnership and mutual respect, despite the obstacles they faced. But I think there's an even deeper lesson in their story, one that's particularly relevant to us today, in our world of instant communication and endless distractions. Peter Abelard and Eloise remind us what it means to truly know another person, to engage with their thoughts, to challenge their assumptions, to support their growth, and to love them not despite their complexity, but because of it. They show us that the most profound relationships aren't the easiest ones, but the ones that push us to become more fully ourselves. Their love didn't make their lives simpler or more comfortable. It made their lives more meaningful, more intellectually rich, and more emotionally honest. Think about the courage it took for Eloise to write that first letter after 15 years of silence. Think about the vulnerability Abelard showed when he admitted that his religious peace might have been built on self-deception. Think about how they both chose growth over comfort, truth over convenience, authentic connection over social approval. In our modern world, where relationships often seem disposable and intellectual discourse has become increasingly polarized, their example feels almost revolutionary. They prove that it's possible to disagree with someone you love without destroying the relationship, to challenge each other intellectually while supporting each other emotionally, to adapt to changing circumstances without abandoning your core values. Their story also reminds us that real achievement often comes from collaboration, not competition. Abelard's greatest theological insights came during his correspondence with Eloise. Her most innovative educational programs were built on ideas they developed together. They made each other better thinkers, better leaders, and better human beings. And finally, their story teaches us something profound about resilience. They faced scandal, violence, separation, and political persecution. They lost their physical relationship, their social standing, and their original dreams for the future. But they never lost their intellectual connection, their mutual respect, or their ability to find meaning in whatever circumstances they faced. That's a kind of strength that transcends any particular time period or social system. It's the strength that comes from knowing who you are, what you value, and how to love another person completely while remaining true to yourself. 900 years after their deaths, Peter Abelard and Héloïse are still buried together at the Père Lachaise cemetery in Paris, where their tomb has become a pilgrimage site for lovers from around the world. People leave flowers, love letters, and small tokens, believing that this couple who found a way to love each other across every imaginable obstacle might somehow bless their own relationships. Whether you believe in that kind of romantic magic or not, there's something deeply moving about the fact that their love story continues to give people hope. In a world that often seems designed to pull people apart, Abelard and Eloise remind us that true connection is possible, that intellectual and emotional love can coexist and strengthen each other, and that the best relationships are the ones that make both people more fully themselves. Their legacy isn't just in the books they wrote or the institutions they founded, though those achievements were considerable. Their real legacy is in the demonstration that love, when it's based on genuine understanding and mutual respect, can survive anything: scandal, separation, persecution, even death itself. And that, perhaps, is the most important lesson any of us can learn about what it means to love and be loved in return. Thank you for joining me on this incredible journey through one of history's most remarkable love stories. I hope it's given you something to think about, whether you're currently in a relationship or still searching for that perfect intellectual and emotional connection. This story of Peter Abelard and Eloise proves that such connections are possible. Even under the most challenging circumstances, stay curious, stay open to love in all its forms, and remember that the best relationships are the ones that challenge you to become the best version of yourself. I'll be back soon with another story that will surprise, inspire, and maybe change how you think about what it means to be human. Until then, sweet dreams, and may your own love stories be filled with the kind of intellectual passion and emotional honesty that made these two medieval lovers immortal.